Linux users have a superiority complex, or at least that's the accusation you hear all the time in comment sections, tech forums, classrooms, offices, and family group chats where someone just wanted help installing a printer driver. It's a stereotype that has persisted for decades. The smug penguin enthusiast who scoffs at Windows, laughs at macOS, and insists that if you're not compiling your own kernel, you're doing computing wrong. But where did this perception come from? Is it exaggerated? Is it deserved? Or is it simply the byproduct of passion colliding with insecurity in the ever-evolving world of technology? To understand why people say Linux users have a superiority complex, we have to start with the culture surrounding Linux itself. Linux isn't just an operating system. It's a philosophy. It represents open source ideals, freedom, transparency, and control. For many people, installing Linux for the first time feels like breaking free from corporate control. It feels like rejecting surveillance, licensing fees, forced updates, and design decisions made by distant. When someone switches to Linux, especially after years of frustration with another system, the change can feel empowering, and empowerment often looks from the outside like arrogance. There's a psychological transformation that can happen when someone solves a hard problem. Installing Linux can be challenging, especially for beginners. You might have 2 partition drives, configure bootloaders, troubleshoot drivers, and learn entirely new work. When you finally get everything running, there's a genuine sense of accomplishment. You didn't just double-click an installer and accept default settings. You navigated complexity, you learned commands, you understood your system. That achievement can create pride. And pride, when expressed without careful tone, can easily be interpreted as superiority. Another factor is knowledge asymmetry. Linux users often have a deeper understanding of how operating systems work compared to the average computer user. Because Linux encourages command line usage and transparency, users are exposed to concepts like file permissions, process management, package dependencies, and kernel modules. This knowledge can create confidence, but when someone explains these concepts in a dismissive or condescending way, it reinforces the stereotype. The moment a Linux user responds to a simple question with "just use the terminal," it can sound like, "if you don't understand this, you're beneath me." There's also the tribal nature of technology communities. Humans naturally form groups and identify with them. In tech, operating systems become identities. People don't just use Linux. They become Linux users. The same goes for Windows users, Mac users, Android users, and iPhone users. Once identity is involved, comparison follows. And once comparison begins, hierarchy creeps in. It's no longer about which system works best for a particular task. It becomes about which choice reflects intelligence, skill, or moral alignment. Linux culture, in particular, has long positioned itself as the alternative to mainstream computing. It's the underdog narrative, the rebel, the hacker's choice. When you align yourself with the underdog, there's often an implicit belief that you see something others don't, that you're more informed, more independent, less manipulated by corporate marketing. That belief can subtly morph into, "I'm smarter because I chose this." Online discourse amplifies this perception. Forums, Reddit threads, and social media platforms reward sharp, witty, sometimes cutting commentary. Nuance gets lost. A Linux enthusiast who calmly explains the benefits of open source software might get less attention than someone who dramatically declares Windows is spyware garbage. The loudest voices become representative of the whole community, and loud voices often lack empathy. Another reason for the superiority stereotype is the barrier to entry. Linux, despite becoming more user-friendly over the years, still requires more intentional learning than mainstream systems. When something is harder to access, those who master it can feel part of an exclusive club. Exclusivity breeds pride. Pride breeds gatekeeping. And gatekeeping is one of the clearest outward signs of a superiority complex. When newcomers ask basic questions and are told to read the manual or Google it, the message isn't just about it can feel like a test of worthiness. There's also a historical element. In the early days of Linux, especially in the 1990s and early 2000s, using Linux often required significant technical skill. It wasn't as polished. Hardware compatibility was inconsistent. Installing a graphical interface could be an achievement in itself. The people who used Linux during that era were often programmers, system administrators, or hobbyists who genuinely enjoyed tinkering. Over time, that culture of technical rigor became part of the community's identity. Even as Linux distributions became more accessible, the legacy mindset remained. At the same time, it's important to question whether the stereotype is entirely fair. Many Linux users are humble, helpful, and genuinely passionate about empowering others. They advocate for privacy, security, and user control, not because they want to feel superior, but because they believe in those values. When they criticize proprietary systems, it's often out of concern rather than contempt. However, passion can easily be misused. If someone deeply cares about digital freedom, they might express frustration when others seem indifferent. That frustration can sound like judgment. There's also the insecurity factor. Ironically, what looks like superiority can sometimes mask defensiveness. Linux has always been a minority desktop operating system, despite dominating servers, supercomputers, and embedded systems on the consumer desktop. It remains niche. Being in the minority can create a sense of constantly needing to justify your choice. When people question Linux's usability or software availability, some users respond with overcompensation. They double down, they list technical advantages, they dismiss opposing views. It becomes less about facts and more about protecting identity. Consider the common exchange where someone says they prefer Windows because it's easier for gaming. A defensive Linux user might respond with a long explanation about compatibility layers, performance benchmarks, and open drivers, concluding with an insinuation that the other person just doesn't understand technology. The underlying message isn't just informational, it's comparative. I know more than you. That's where the superiority narrative takes root. But we should also examine how mainstream tech marketing influences perception. Commercial operating systems are designed for convenience and mass appeal. They prioritize user-friendliness and integration. Linux, by contrast, often prioritizes flexibility and transparency. When a Linux user critiques a mainstream OS 4 hiding system details or limiting customization, they're pointing out real design differences. Yet the critique can be interpreted as moral judgment. You're choosing convenience over freedom. That framing implicitly elevates one choice over another. There's a philosophical divide at play. Some people view computers primarily as tools. They want them to work reliably with minimal effort. Others view computers as systems to understand and shape. Linux attracts the latter group. When those two mindsets collide, friction arises. The tool-oriented user might see Linux enthusiasts as overcomplicating simple tasks. The system-oriented user might see mainstream users as complacent. Each side perceives the other through their own values. The meme culture around Linux also contributes. Jokes about "I use Arch," by the way, or screenshots of elaborate tiling window managers create an aura of elite. Even when these memes are self-aware and ironic, they reinforce the stereotype. Humor often contains a kernel of truth. When people repeatedly joke about being superior, it subtly normalizes the idea. Another aspect is the emphasis on Linux communities often encourage learning, documentation reading, and problem solving. These are positive traits. However, when empathy is missing, encouragement turns into dismissal. A beginner asking how to install software might receive a technically correct but socially tone-deaf response. Over time, these interactions accumulate into a reputation. We should also consider how expertise in any domain can lead to perceived superiority. It's not unique to Linux. Photographers debate camera brands, car enthusiasts argue about transmissions, programmers argue about programming languages. Expertise creates standards. Standards create judgments. When someone deeply understands a system, they notice inefficiencies others ignore. Pointing those out can feel like superiority, even if it's simply observation. It's worth acknowledging that some Linux users genuinely do exhibit a superiority complex. They equate technical knowledge with intelligence. They measure worth by command-line proficiency. They dismiss alternative workflows as inferior. These individuals exist in every community. The difference is that Linux, because of its countercultural roots, sometimes attracts people who derive identity from being different. Being different can be empowering. It can also become a source of ego. At the same time, the narrative of superiority can discourage newcomers. If someone is curious about Linux but fears being judged for not knowing enough, they might never try. That's a loss for the community. Healthy ecosystems require approachability. Many modern Linux advocates recognize this and actively work to create welcoming spaces. beginner-friendly documentation, and supportive forums. We should also examine the role of comparison itself. Why do we need to rank operating systems morally or intellectually? Each system has trade-offs. Windows prioritizes compatibility and market reach. macOS prioritizes ecosystem integration and design coherence. Linux prioritizes openness and customization. Different priorities serve different users. Superiority implies a universal hierarchy, but computing needs are contextual. There's a deeper philosophical question beneath the stereotype. What does it mean to be superior in technology? Is it about performance metrics, security models, user freedom, market share, ease of use? The criteria vary depending on perspective. When Linux users argue from a freedom-centric framework, they're using a different yardstick than someone who values plug-and-play simplicity. Without acknowledging the metric being used, conversations become moralized. Another interesting dimension is the learning curve narrative. Some Linux users view the learning curve not as a drawback, but as a feature. They believe that effort invested leads to understanding, and understanding leads to empowerment. This belief can subtly imply that those unwilling to invest effort are less committed or less curious. Again, what feels like motivation to one person feels like judgment to another. We also can't ignore the influence of open source ideology. Open source isn't just about code visibility. It's about collaborative development, community governance, and transparency. Advocates often see it as ethically superior to proprietary development. When ethical language enters technical discussions, superiority perceptions intensify. If one model is framed as morally better, those who don't adopt it can feel implicitly criticized. At the same time, Linux users often face misconceptions themselves. They're portrayed as antisocial hackers living in basements, obsessing over terminal commands. That caricature can lead to defensiveness. When you're constantly stereotyped, you might lean into pride as armor. Pride can look like superiority. It's also worth noting how Linux's dominance in certain professional domains influences identity. Linux powers much of the internet's infrastructure: servers, cloud platforms, supercomputers, embedded devices. This reality can create a sense of validation among users. The world runs on Linux. While factually accurate in many contexts, repeating this line in desktop debates can sound like triumphalism. Context matters. Server dominance doesn't automatically translate to desktop preference superiority. The evolution of Linux distributions toward user-friendliness challenges the old gatekeeping culture. Modern distributions offer graphical installers, app stores, and automatic updates. As accessibility increases, the community becomes more diverse. Diversity tends to soften superiority dynamics because it introduces varied motivations for using the system. Not everyone installs Linux to prove technical prowess. Some do it for privacy, some for performance on older hardware, some simply out of curiosity. Ultimately, the question isn't whether Linux users have a superiority complex. Some do, some don't. The more important question is why the perception persists. It persists because identity, effort, minority, status, philosophical commitment, and online communication styles intersect in a way that amplifies pride and minimizes nuance. There's an opportunity here for reflection. Passion for technology doesn't require contempt for alternative choices. Expertise doesn't require condescension. Advocacy doesn't require moral grandstanding. The healthiest communities balance confidence with humility. They share knowledge without weaponizing it. They recognize trade-offs without framing them as personal failings. Perhaps the stereotype of the superior Linux user is a cautionary tale about what happens when enthusiasm loses empathy. It reminds us that being right technically doesn't automatically make us right socially. It encourages. When explaining why you prefer a particular system, are you informing or are you performing? Are you inviting curiosity or asserting hierarchy? In the end, operating systems are tools created by humans to solve problems. They reflect different philosophies and priorities. Choosing one over another says something about your preferences, not your worth. If Linux users sometimes appear superior, it may be because they've experienced the empowerment of understanding their tools deeply. The challenge is translating that empowerment into inclusion rather than exclusion. Technology evolves, communities evolve, stereotypes can fade when behavior changes. The future of Linux culture depends not just on code contributions, but on interpersonal ones, on patience, on welcoming beginners, on acknowledging that convenience and freedom are both valid values, on recognizing that intelligence isn't measured by terminal commands, so Do Linux users have a superiority complex? Some might. But the more constructive conversation is about how any passionate community can avoid drifting into elite. It's about how to celebrate knowledge without turning it into a hierarchy. It's about remembering that the goal of technology is to serve people, not divide them. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone asks for help installing a printer driver, the best response won't be a lecture on kernel modules or a smug remark about proprietary firmware. It will be simple, patient guidance, because true expertise doesn't need to announce itself. It demonstrates itself quietly through generosity.